You are listening to I Am Refocused Radio with your host, Shamaya Reed. This show is designed to inspire you to live your purpose and regain your focus. And now, here's your host, Shamaya Reed.
Hey, welcome to I Am Refocused Radio. We are here again, and just like any other time, we have another show lined up for y'all today. Today, we have a true special guest. Her name is Julie Brill, and she's going to share with us her amazing book. She has a book that you can check out. I feel that you're going to really enjoy it. It's something that I feel can educate our audience. Book title is Hidden in Plain Sight, a family memoir and the Untold story of the Holocaust in Serbia. And you can go to her website. It's on the ticker tape if you're watching us. It's juliebrill.com. We're going to first learn a little bit about her professional background and what prompted her to write this book. So first and foremost, Julie, thank you for being here. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate you being here. So before we jump right into the book real fast, kind of tell us your journey about being a published book author and what prompted you to want to share this story.
Yeah, thank you for asking. So my father was born in Belgrade, what was Yugoslavia then, in 1938. And survived the war, the Holocaust, as a young Jewish child. And I always marveled at how that was possible from the time that I was a little girl. And he had these very young child memories that he would share with me. So he was not even 3 when the Holocaust started. And the Holocaust started with the bombing of Belgrade. So he remembers the German bombing. He remembers running through the street with his mother. They were headed towards a bomb shelter. He remembers the sounds the bombs made. And he would share these stories with me, and I was like, I never could understand the larger context, which I think is typical for, we're called 2Gs for the children, the second generation of Holocaust survivors. We learn the story sort of from the inside out. We learn a little piece of our family story, and then gradually we learn the context. But in my case, because the context was Yugoslavia, he was in Serbia, what's now Serbia, we never learned that context. Very few people know about the Holocaust in Serbia. So I never, as a child, could fit it in. And I was learning the story of what happened in Germany. And we learned what happened in Poland with Auschwitz and the cattle cars and Anne Frank hiding in Holland. And the Yugoslavian story, the Serbian story is just very, very different. So that's what put me on the path, trying to understand how my father survived and what the larger context was historically.
When you look at the process of writing the chapters in the book, were there any parts that were mostly difficult for you to process or just write? And if so, how were you able to get through those sections?
Yeah, there were a lot of challenges. Part of it was the story wasn't finished when I started writing it. So I started writing in 2017 and the story ends in 2022. So you really can't write a story if you don't know the ending. You're like writing towards an ending you haven't lived yet. That was very much my experience. So it was good in that I was getting the details and the emotions down as they were happening, but hard in that I didn't know what was going to happen because nobody knows the future. That was one challenge. I really wanted to be historically accurate and be true to the people in the book, family members who didn't survive, who I never got to meet, but were very much real people. I didn't want to make something up or write about something that could have happened. I wanted to write about what did happen. And so getting the information was challenging. I don't speak Serbian. Getting the documents, learning the history was hard, and just living with that history. So it's tough stuff, the story of the Holocaust. And at one point I thought, okay, there's like a no genocide before bedtime rule. I cannot read the stuff and go to bed because I would just dream about it all night long. So those were the major challenges.
Knowing those challenges that you were facing, not everybody will be willing to muscle through it and still get the book done because it's one thing, this grand idea, but being able to face these challenges and create different ways for you to meet them head on. My next question for you would be, when you look at the backstory of Jewish communities and the focus of the part of your story, Holocaust in Serbia, why you think that maybe some of this is missing from mainstream narratives, and what some ways do you address those storylines in the book?
Yeah, definitely missing from mainstream narratives. At one point, while I was writing the book, I went to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is the largest Holocaust museum in the United States and one of the largest in the world. And I went to the bookstore, and they have the books alphabetically by country. So I go to Y for Yugoslavia, and there's nothing. So that was when I knew I had to write it. The answer, I think, to your question of why was there no book on Yugoslavia is you need survivors to tell the story. And now you need descendants to tell the story. And the Holocaust was so fast and so early in Belgrade, where my family was living, and so complete that there were really very few people to tell that story after the war. There's something that's known as the Auschwitz paradox. So that's Timothy Snyder, who coined that term. He's a historian. And the idea is Auschwitz was a terrible place. 1 million people were murdered there. There had never been death on that scale in that way before. But there were also tens of thousands of mostly young Jewish survivors who were just in their teens and 20s in the 40s. So they told their story, many of them, over and over again. And we know the story of Auschwitz. In Serbia, basically, if you went to a camp, you didn't come out. There was nobody who survived. And that is more typical of the Holocaust history than Auschwitz is. So in Eastern Europe, more Jews were murdered outside the camps than in them, and more Jews overall were murdered close to where they lived, not with gas, but by gunfire. So it's a more typical story, and yet the story we don't know.
Once again, you're listening to Refocused Radio and watching us online. Talking to our guest today, Julie Brill. You can go to her website, juliebrill.com. We're talking about her book that you can get is available, Hidden in Plain Sight, a family memoir and the untold story of the Holocaust in Serbia. My next question is, when you explore how younger generations are reacting to, it's not Stranger Things, just this topic is something that is heavy.
Yeah.
What do you hope that the younger people will be able to appreciate from this book from an educational point? Because history is history, and if we don't learn it, like they say, we're bound to repeat.
Yeah. I think a lot about, like, why are we retelling these terrible stories? What is the value to that? Like you said, history repeats, or it rhymes. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. We learn when we talk about the Holocaust, never again, but we have had other genocides. We're having other genocides again. So I think the only hope is to learn the history, learn what led up to the Holocaust. It doesn't start with the bombing of Belgrade in 1941. The Nazi Party, Hitler, had been in power since the early 30s in Germany. It's a slow rise so that we can watch for those early signs and hopefully act. We talk to kids about being upstanders and not bystanders. What can you do that makes a positive difference?
You described earlier about your father. Want to dig deeper into that. When you remember his memories, you mentioned how they were fragmented and confusing. While you was piecing together his side story and facts, what was it like to just kind of dig through and find out the real stories?
Yeah, it was very validating for me, and I think for my dad as well. Everything he remembered, even though I didn't know enough of the history to understand what he was talking about, everything he remembered was accurate. So one of the stories he told us was really a story that he had heard from my grandmother. But what happened to my grandfather was he was held in a camp in the center of Belgrade, and that's not the Holocaust story that we hear. And I was always like, how did my grandmother go and bring, my grandfather food? And how could that be? It just sounded so like made up or unimaginable. But when you look at the history, that is actually what happened. The Germans were very deliberate. They were sending a message to the Serbs to try to quell rebellion and resistance. So they put this terrible camp right in the city where everyone could see it.
How did you balance the emotional weight of understanding that the accuracy was not just important, but the responsibility to make sure that these stories were brought to light?
Yeah, I felt a great responsibility telling the story. I'm kind of a reluctant memoirist. As I was collecting the stories and the data and running it by my dad, and we went to Belgrade 3 times and, doing research and all of that, I always felt until, a year or two before publication, if someone else scoops this, if someone else writes this story about what happened to the Jews of Serbia, great, because it does feel like a huge responsibility. But one of the gratifying things is now the book is out in the world, and so many people are so appreciative of knowing this story, and everybody starts by saying, like, I'm so sorry I didn't know it. And the answer is, like, of course you didn't know it. Who knows the story? We don't know it as Americans. They don't really know it in Serbia. No one has learned this story. So now it's out in the world.
When you look at the impact of the book and the legacy of the people in the books, the real facts in the book, you have been able to receive publicity of this book, recognition, a lot of praise. Was your personal feedback, if you took a step back and say, okay, I'm here now, I'm on these shows talking about the book being out.
Yeah.
But is a lot of people that are reacting to this?
Yeah, there's a lot of emotion. A lot of people feel connected to the story in different ways. I mean, they have perhaps their own family legacy of trauma, or they have their own family legacy of secrets, or they're interested in uncovering their own family history. So a lot of people can connect with it. I'm not necessarily like this giant extrovert who wants to go out in the world and, keep telling about my family, but I feel like sort of a spokesperson for this genocide. Just because there aren't very many of us.
If you have one reaction that you can pick that was the most unexpected from your book, what would that be, and how did that kind of put things in perspective as far as how people took it?
Yeah, so it's very interesting to me how universal the story is. I sort of wrote the story as, this is my family. No family is exactly like my family. Our history is unusual, but lots of people identify with it, kind of being on a middle-age quest to find out your history while you can, talking to older relatives, or wanting to pass down family history to their children. And what has been so interesting, and I've been on the other side of this reading memoir, but when you read a memoir, you kind of feel like you know the person a little bit. That's one of the reasons people read memoir, but it's a one-sided relationship. I don't know necessarily people who are reading my book, and people are now coming forward with their own family stories, which, I haven't asked for, but I think it's, once somebody starts to talk and you identify with them and you also have your family stories, there's something very freeing about that. The thing with family secrets is we don't know them, but we do. So when you find out a secret, it completes something. It makes something that happened in the past make sense. It's a piece of the puzzle. And so people are sharing those aha moments with me. I didn't expect that.
When you look at your grandfather, I want to talk about him for a minute.
Yeah.
If you were able to sit down and talk to him, what would you want to say or ask after that you have written your book? What would you want to ask him or say to him?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that's been lost. My father has these very accurate memories of being 2 and 3 in the war. And even though my grandfather was still with the family at the beginning of the war, my father doesn't remember him. So sometimes, forgetting can be protective. So everything my father knows about my grandfather was passed down to him, mostly from his mother, my grandmother. And so there are a lot of holes. I never got to meet my grandmother either. So I just would want to kind of know, the kind of things you get to know when you are, figuring somebody out, like, just small talk, kind of like favorite foods and passions and interests and all of that. My grandfather was murdered in his early 30s. So now I'm sort of like his mother. Age-wise, there's this weird thing with the generations. I feel very protective of him when I look at the pictures because, of course, I know what's going to happen. And looking at him in those pictures, like I have a picture of their wedding day, he doesn't know, of course, the future. I always thought when I was a kid if I could somehow warn them. But what I understand now is the Holocaust came so fast and so early. Even if you were Jewish and living in Belgrade and you somehow knew the future, you still might not have been able to get out. So many people were just trapped.
Once again, you listen to Refocused Radio, talking to our guest today, Julie Brill. Go to her website, juliebrill.com. We're talking about her book, Hidden in Plain Sight. You can get it right now. It's available. So I want you to definitely go support that. I consider the fact that it's not easy to, one, share your ideas with the world because they're going to get feedback, whether it's good or bad.
Yeah.
So with that thought in mind, were you at all nervous publishing the book, or were you like, you know what, this has to happen, and whatever happens next, I'm ready?
I feel like the answer is yes. Yes, I was nervous, and yes, I was ready. You can be both. I had the good fortune to have a number of essays published over the last 5 years or so on this topic. And that was a great warm-up because it's just a little piece of your family history going out into the world and people respond and give you feedback, good and bad. And so I had like these sort of homeopathic doses, these little doses of having the story come out and, reading the comments or not reading the comments. And I think my family did too. I mean, I don't think my father initially ever thought these stories would be so public and the pictures would be out in the world. And so we all kind of got, by degree got used to it, which was good, dip your toe in the water first.
And when you look at how this book is starting to make a buzz and people are giving their comments and reviews, what has been your family's reaction to people reacting to your book? Because that has to be something to where they're seeing, wow, like we're actually touching people's lives and, shedding some light on stories that need to be told.
Yeah, I think my family has been surprised by how much interest there is in the story because, of course, it's just our story. We always knew it. It's not new to us. My father is the kind of survivor who talked about what happened to him. There are many Holocaust survivors where those stories just were never told. In my family, they definitely were told. But, to have them out in the world is a different thing. And now there is, interest in hearing from him, which is, I think, a nice perk, a nice surprise for him in his older age.
I mean, you see how there's still some conflict in today's world. There's still disagreements. What do you hope that your book will be able to bring to light, not just from history, but maybe from a perspective that there's some value that you can take away from this and from these people's stories?
Yeah, I mean, the Holocaust is like a worst case scenario, right? So it just shows us, what's the worst that can happen? This is the worst that can happen. 6 million Jews, 11 million civilians murdered. It's the constant reminder of why we need to do better, in terms of peace treaties and working it out and diplomatic relations and all of those things that help prevent getting to this stage. And it could have been worse. It's only that the U.S. came in and there were some lucky things and that World War II ended the way it did.
When you see the negative talks that are happening in the headlines, younger people being vocal, it's a mixed bag. Everyone's being vocal in their own opinion. What do you hope can possibly change in the U.S. as far as how we look at Jewish people and also how we can do better as far as not trying to, not try to go the dark way, the dark path, because if we're not careful, the noise will start to get louder.
Yeah, I mean, we need to protect our First Amendment rights, our right to free speech. That's what you need for a democracy. We need to allow for a dissent of opinions. That's okay. People are allowed to have different opinions. We need to be able to talk about what's happening and also what has happened in the past. I think that is the way out. I think as people get more divided and more extreme and stop listening to each other, that's really where the danger is. Letting students speak on campus, that's not scary to me. Distinguishing between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is really important. You can speak out against the Israeli government. We still have our First Amendment rights. You can speak out against the U.S. government if you want. That is not an attack on the people who live there. I mean, I certainly have said things about the U.S. government. I'm not anti-American. So it's the same thing with Israel.
When you look at the value of history and how it can really allow people to see truth without filters, going further on that route, when you see so many division that is more visible than ever because we have social media that will amplify some of these divisions. How can history lessons help us build bridges versus create these walls of I'm just not going to budge?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, right? When we're living through history, and of course we're all living through history all the time, we don't know the outcome. I live outside of Boston. We just celebrated the 250th anniversary of the start of the Revolutionary War, and I went to where the first battle was. And you think about like the men who died on that day who didn't know they were like the first victims of the casualties of the American Revolution. They just knew it was, a really scary day. So I think when we look back and we have that perspective of history, that's where we can try to look at, okay, what is happening now and where could this be headed if we don't turn things around, because it doesn't happen all at once. It happens in little bits. So, what happens if we lose our due process rights? What happens if we lose our First Amendment rights? You need to be focused on that at the beginning, which is now. We don't know where we're going, but we want to turn it around.
Once again, you've been listening to our Refocused Radio, watching us online, talking to our guest today. You can go to her website, juliebrill.com, and get a copy of her book, Hidden in Plain Sight, a family memoir and the untold story of the Holocaust in Serbia. I know that nothing is easy if it's valuable.
Yeah.
And when you understand that trouble is not always going to define you, it's how you react to it based on what you've been able to research and learn throughout the whole process through your family. What's one rewarding thing that you appreciate, understanding that despite pain and trouble, there's always hope?
Yeah, I mean, my story is a story of loss, of course, and this is not a spoiler. My grandfather was murdered early in the Holocaust for, no reason. He was Jewish. He didn't commit a crime. He, was just a man in his early 30s living his life with his wife and his young son. But it's also a story of resilience. There are people who survived the Holocaust. There are people who were not Jewish who helped to make that happen. There were people who actively resisted. My father actually has 3 uncles who fought in the Partisans, which was the resistance, the Yugoslav resistance to the German occupation. So I think knowing some of those individual stories of people who did stand up and make a difference, it's not all dark, for sure.
The last question for you is, when you look at young people, we have all the time next generation that is going to be responsible to lead the way.
Yeah.
If you have one strong message of inspiration and hope, what would you want to share with the next generation as they start to lead?
Yeah, so it's this paradox, right? I was talking about like one person can make a difference, and that's true. And it's also coming together, because more people can make more of a difference. And just looking at the greater goal and not the little divisions. There's a line in the suffrage musical where they sing, you won't always like your leaders or you won't like your leaders. That's okay, right? If it's moving in the direction that you want to go, that's the train you want to get on.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I know I said one more question, but I had to sneak one more before.
I'm ready.
As a publisher, if you had wisdom that you would give your younger, experienced published self, what would you give to yourself to understand for the next round? Because we all know once you get the book out there, the hardest part is the marketing and getting the word out. What have you learned? What would you share with your younger self?
Yeah, it's a little bit of what I was saying, like work together, right? I've had a number of people from different organizations and even just like individuals who are like, we want to help you with that story. So that's been really rewarding. You hear a lot of no's. Writing a book, getting it published, getting it out in the world, you have to kind of just keep going. When I was working on the book, I had made a cover. It doesn't look anything like the real cover, but I went on Canva and I made a cover and I kept looking at it every day. Like, someday this will be a book, because it just feels like a pile of words in the beginning. So if you want to write a book, you can do it one paragraph at a time or whatever it is that you're trying to work on. I quilt. And so I always think of one little piece of fabric together and another, and eventually it's a quilt. It's the project you're working on.
Well, once again, been listening to Refocused Radio and watching us online, talking to our guest, Julie Brill. Go get her book. Go to her website, juliebrill.com. And like always, for you, like we say to everyone else, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me and helping me share my family's story.